Alright guys, I'm going to read the next chapter of what was the Titanic. I left off at the end of chapter 1, so I'm going to start with chapter 2 now. Chapter 2 is called Building the Titanic. The White Star Line decided to build 3 new ships. One would be named the Titanic. The names of all White Star ships ended in "ick." Hundreds of blueprints and drawings were made. These plans would guide the workers during construction. In March 1909, construction began at a huge shipyard in Belfast, Northern Ireland. Ships are built from the bottom up. First came the keel, which serves as the backbone of the ship and lies on its bottom. The keel is made of steel and supports the rest of the ship. After the keel was made, curved steel beams joined the keel to form a U-shaped frame. The upper decks of the ship would eventually be built on the top of the beams. The framing of the Titanic took about a year and was completed in April 1910. Building the hull came next. The hull is the lower part of the ship that sits partly below water. It helps keep the ship afloat. It took about 6 months to finish the hull. First, thousands of large sheets of steel were cut and shaped into plates. Some plates were flat and some were curved. The plates were lined up side by side with their edges overlapping. Then rivets, large iron tacks, were heated and inserted into holes in the steel plates. More than 3 million rivets were used on the Titanic. The hull was divided into 16 separate compartments. Walls called bulkheads separated them. If for any reason the ship started flooding, watertight doors in the bulkheads would instantly shut. The flooded compartments would be blocked off from one another. The Titanic could stay afloat even if the first 4 compartments filled with water, and it was hard to imagine any accident that would cause more flooding than that. Because of this, the newspapers called the Titanic unsinkable. They didn't say almost unsinkable. They said unsinkable. And we know that wasn't true, because we know at the end, it sinks. Who built the Titanic? Over 15,000 Irish shipyard workers. It was a grueling job. That means it was a really hard job. They worked Monday to Saturday from 6 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. They had a 10-minute break in the morning and a half-hour off for lunch. It was dangerous work. 8 men died during the ship's construction. This illustration just shows how they're building it. It's a very dangerous job. On May 31st, 1911, the hull of the Titanic was ready to be launched into the River Lagan. The black-painted hull now had the upper deck and 4 smokestacks, but was empty inside. The launch would show whether the ship could stay afloat. Launching an ocean liner was a big event. It was exciting to see a giant, freshly painted hull pulled down a ramp into the water for the first time. Because remember, they built the boat actually on land. It wasn't built in the water. So this was a big deal that they were going to now put it in the water. Nearly 100,000 people gathered to see the Titanic's launch. J. Bruce Ismay, director of the White Star Line, watched from a special grandstand. Wealthy American businessman J.P. Morgan was also there. His company owned the White Star Line. When it was time, 2 bright red rockets exploded. This was to warn ships in the river to stay away from the launch site. It took 62 seconds for the hull to slide off its wooden platforms into the water. Yes, the Titanic was seaworthy, and that means that when they put it in the water, it didn't sink. The workmen waved their hats and the crowd cheered. Because the Titanic had no engine yet, smaller boats towed it up the river for a few minutes. Big anchors and cables prevented the ship from floating away. Then tugboats brought the Titanic back to the shipyard. Now it was time to work on the inside, to turn the shell of the Titanic into a palace on the seas. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 2. I will read and post chapter 3, fitting out the ship, tomorrow.